Hello and welcome to Gardening at 58 North. So in this video I'd like to show you how to take willow cuttings. So willow is one of the easiest plants in the world to grow from cuttings. Very little experience is needed and you can make lots of mistakes with the willow cutting and you'll still get them to root. Willow is just one of those plants that just absolutely wants to root whenever it can. And unlike most cuttings where you have to worry about the rotting off, willow loves wet soil, and so you very rarely have any kind of rot issues with willow, and so you'll get a nice cutting nearly every time. But there are a few tips that you should know about to increase your chances. Make sure that your willow roots every time and roots with the best, strongest root system that you can get for it. So these are my willows here. Willows are a very wide category of plants. There's lots of different species of willow in the genus of Salix, which is the willow genus. So there's lots of different types and they all look quite different. This is your example of a hybrid willow which you would use for basket weaving or you would use for fencing or any kind of willow structure. So this is the one I'm going to be using today, but you can use these principles on any willow. The only difference will be that most other willows will have a shorter length of stem. So when you're pruning a nice section for taking a cutting from, just bear that in mind. You'll probably have smaller pieces for the cutting material. So when it comes to growing willow from cuttings, the time of year is quite important. It is possible to do this whilst it's in leaf, but it's very difficult and it's not worth the hassle. If you grow these at the correct time, it's very easy. So what you're wanting is any time when the tree is dormant. So any time from probably November time through to March time when there's no leaves on the tree, that's the perfect time to do your cutting. So basically winter time. Now, there is an optimum time within that window. As I say, you'll be able to propagate any time in that window, but the most optimum time is late winter. The reason for that is the sap's starting to rise up into the cut plants, so they've got a little bit more water in them and a little bit more nutrients as well. Also, they're not going to be in the ground long before they start rooting, so February time is probably the ideal time. But as I say, any time from autumn right through to spring is absolutely fine, as long as they haven't started to burst their buds and grow new growth, and as long as the leaves have fallen off in autumn, then you're fine to go ahead and plant your cuttings. So when you're looking for a nice bit of willow to take a cutting from, you're looking for last year's growth. So these are all 1 year growth canes. Although these ones, some of them have side branches, generally what you will find is 1 year's growth will have no side branches, and you'll be able to look at the color of the bark as well. This one, for example, is a light green color. As it gets older, it goes to more of a tan color and then more like just like gray bark. So you can tell the age of the branch by that. You can root cuttings which are from stems that are older than a year old, but you're best really to go with that 1 year old cutting. It's the most likely to root and it will root the best for you as well. So once you find stems that are that old, you then want to cut off a piece, ideally about a thickness of a pencil or a little bit thicker. Again, with willow, it doesn't matter too much. I wouldn't go for some really thin pieces. They're not going to do well. Thinner than a pencil are going to struggle. But you can also go up to really quite thick branches. And I've planted ones as thick as my wrist before and they've taken no problem at all. So go for a slightly thicker stem if you can. As long as it's first year's growth, you can go for a fairly thick one. So what you want to do is you want to get your secateurs, find the stem you want. I'm going to use this one, for example. Now you want to cut this back either to a bud, or you want to cut it right back to the base of the plant where it comes off from a main stem. And then we want to get this prepared and ready to take cuttings from. So now that we've cut our piece of willow off, it's time to get it ready for using as a cutting. So when you cut it off from the tree, one good thing to do before you put it down and forget which way is up, just to make it easier for yourself, is the section that's the bottom of the stem, cut it at a slight angle so that you're going to have a nice pointy end. That way it's easier to push it into the ground, and also you'll be able to remember which is the bottom, which is the top. So now that we've done that, we can remember which is the bottom. That's one of the most important things, is to make sure that the cutting goes in the right direction. So what we're looking for here is, if we don't know which direction it was in, we can have a look at the buds. So looking at the buds here, these are the buds on the side of the stem. And what you're looking for is this little bits coming out the side. These buds, what they do is they point upwards. So this is the top going up, and then down is the base of the plant. So you're just looking for that little shoot and it's pointing up. That tells you which way the stem should be. So this is the correct orientation. If you had the buds and they were pointing more like this direction here, pointing down, that would be upside down. So that wouldn't be correct. So that's how you can tell which way you want to have the cuttings round. A stem like this, you could, if you wanted, use this whole thing as the cutting. I'll show you some trees later which I've put as 2 or 3 meter long cuttings, they've taken root just fine. But ideally you're looking for about a foot in length, especially if it's for the more vigorous hybrid willows. So this one here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut it up at this section here. If you just ignore this side branch, because as I say, normally you're not going to have side branches on 1 year's growth. My one just has it as an exception. What you're looking for is a bud. So again, find that bud, and what you're wanting to do is you want to cut it just above that bud. What I like to do is a straight cut. It doesn't really matter too much about willow doing a straight cut or a slanted cut to stop the rot getting in. Willow doesn't, it's going to probably die back a bit at the top anyway. What you're wanting to do is cut it straight. The reason being is so you can remember which is the top and which is the bottom, just so it's easier to remember. So we cut that there, and that's pretty much all we need to do for our willow cutting. Now, as I say, 1 foot in length is pretty ideal. It's a good balance between getting lots of cutting material from one branch and having a decent sized cutting that it will get a good head start. If you're planting this in a grassy field and you're going to have a lot of competition with grass, you might want to go for a whole meter length of willow cutting. That way it's well above the grass, and when it establishes, it's going to have a much more strong, vigorous root system, and it can compete with the local grass. The thing is with willow is there's a lot of energy stored in these canes, and if you get a larger one, there'll be a lot more energy for it then to put its roots down. Now, the only time that willow cane might be too large is if you're somewhere with quite dry soil or a very windy location and it dries out before it can get its roots fully established. But if you're planting in a wet location or a cool climate, you can pretty go up to any size you want with willow cuttings, and they will take root. So what you could also do with this is you could just take individual cuttings with just 1 or 2 shoots on them if you wanted to rapidly produce a lot of willow plants from one small piece of cutting material. The advantage of that is you can then make hundreds of plants from a small bit of material. The only disadvantage is that each individual plant will be very weak. You'll need to put them into pots individually and grow them on like that, otherwise they're going to really struggle. So what you want to do is go through your willow, get all these cut as you'd like them. Don't worry too much about cutting to a bud at the bottom. They will root out of anywhere on the willow. Just make sure you've got that slant so you know that the pointy end is the bit that goes in the ground. And as I say, just keep cutting to the bud, make lots of willow lengths, as many cuttings as you want. So that's how willow cutting is now taken. I'll now show you how to root them. Now, it's a common misconception that you should root them in water. Rooting them in water is really not a good thing to do. Now, it might seem like a good idea to root them in water because willow likes water and they root really well in water, but it's going to cause you a whole load of problems in the future. So the problem with rooting it in water is you get loads of long, thin roots. These roots are going to be incredibly fragile. When you plant them in the soil, these roots are going to probably snap off, so you're going to lose a lot of those roots anyway. The other problem is those roots will be adapted to water. They're not going to be used to growing in soil. So when you then put them into soil, they'll go into shock and the plant will really struggle to adapt to that new environment, and you're more likely for the whole cutting to dry up and die. So starting willow in water is a sure way for your willow cuttings to not succeed and to die. What you really want to do is start them in soil. That's all you need to do. It's a lot easier, and you're not going to have all those problems with transferring it from water. So I'll show you now how you would plant this in the soil. So I'm just going to use this bare bit of soil here as an example of how you can plant your cuttings in the ground. So what you're wanting to do is you want to get your willow as deep as possible. It's very simple. You don't even need to dig a hole. All you need to do is push it down, and that's part of the reason you want to have that point on the end of your willow cutting to make it easier. And I'm just going to push this down as deep as I can easily get it in until we've only got about 3 or 4 stems above the soil surface like that. I'm just going to go along and do the same with the other one. Now, the spacing really depends on your willow species and whether you're going to grow them as a type pollard or you want them to grow as a large tree. It's up to you what kind of spacing you want. If you're wanting a pollard system like I've got here, we've just done a 1 foot gap between them. If you want it as a large tree, you probably want 3 or 4 meters, maybe even 10 meters for some species. So again, just pushing it into the ground. What you want to do when pushing it into the ground is don't push it from the very top, because that will just bend and snap. Push it from the bottom of the stem down, and then just keep working it in until you get that good depth. Now, if you've got very compact soil or you've got a lot of stones in your soil, you may need to dig with a trowel or even just ram a stick or a rod to get that space to get your willow in. And that's all it is to it, pretty much. All you need to do now is make sure the soil stays nice and damp. So if you're doing this at the correct time of year, which will be winter, that shouldn't be a problem in most places in the world. The soil should be damp in winter time. You just leave it. It will naturally put its roots down and then start growing the root shoots in the spring, and there's nothing you really need to do. And then when it gets to around May time, when you get some good growth on it, keep it well watered for the first year. If you're doing this somewhere that is a bit drier, make sure it's kept well watered. If you do have dry soils where you live, it will need to be kept well watered for the first few years until it gets its roots down. If you're living somewhere like the UK, you just need to keep it well watered for the first 2 years. But as I say, if it's in a damp location, which ideally you would be choosing a damp location for your willow plants, you might get away with just watering it for the first few months as it's getting its roots established. So that's all it is that's needed to plant these willow cuttings. Very easy to do, not much work at all needed with willow. One of the easiest things you can plant and take cuttings from. And I'll just show you a couple of cuttings now that I planted about 3 or 4 years ago that were about 2 or 3 meters in size when I put them in the ground. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about cutting sizes. So here, for example, we have a nice row of hybrid willows. These cuttings were put in at 1 foot high and then allowed to grow 1 meter and then coppiced. But you could put these in at 1 meter in height if you wanted to, and then you'd get that nice coppice effect straight away almost. And you could just keep cutting to that 1 meter height. We went for the 1 foot lengths with these ones, and we planted them in a similar way to what I just showed you back here. So basically, these were foot long cuttings. It just was more economical to have smaller cuttings than to have very large cuttings. And we just planted them, to say, about this depth here, so about probably 4 inches or 10 centimeters, sowing out the top of the ground, the rest underground, so about 3/4 underground. Let them grow, and I think these are now about 8 or 9 years old, so that gives you a sense of how fast they can grow and the size they can get to. But I'll now show you some much larger cuttings that I took 3 or 4 years ago to show you that you can really plant really quite large cuttings if you want to. So the plants I'm about to show you in the ground are similar to what these cuttings were like when they first went in. These are 1 year old lengths of willow. They're between 2 and 4 meters in length. I just basically poked them in the ground and left them, and that's all there was to it. And they just took off within the same summer and grew quite vigorously. Now, when it comes to larger cuttings, you will find the amount of growth they put on in the first year will be quite small. Although you got that head start with a much larger plant, the amount of growth in the first year will probably only be 1 foot or so. Whereas if you plant a smaller cutting, you could get 2 or 3, 4, maybe 5 foot of growth in the first year, but you're starting at a smaller starting point. When it comes to the second or third year, the larger cuttings will then start to take off and grow well for you. So here are the cuttings. There's 4 of them in total. As I say, these were planted about 2 or 3 meters in height, and they've been allowed to grow for about 3 years now. So what's happened is I've just pushed them in the ground. There was quite a bit of grass around here, but because they were big cuttings, they took off no problem at all. They could easily compete with the grass. And then the first year, they just put out a few side branches, not much height. And every year since then, they've been putting out lots more side branches and growing further. So I'll show you the size. These are probably about 5, maybe 6 meters in height at the moment. So these were 2 or 3 meter long cuttings. I pushed them down as deep as I can. We have very sandy soil here, so I was able to push them around about 1 meter deep in the soil. The taller your cutting, the deeper it needs to be. Ideally, a cutting will have more material in the ground than above it. But if you're living in a more damp, humid environment, you can get away with having less cutting material in the ground as compared to what's above the ground, because they won't dry out quite as quick. So these here, although, as I say, they're about 2 or 3 meters high, they were, you can see here, about this height when it first went in, so about 1.5 meters. Same here, 1.5 meters. This one was closer to 2 meters above the ground when it went in, but they then had about 1 meter underground that kept them supported. So that's all for this video, just to show you how to plant willow cuttings. Very easy to do. Just bear in mind when growing willow, be careful what variety you grow. Some willow aren't suitable near houses, as their roots can be quite invasive.